Hey, so Weweb is a wonderful low-code platform, but it sometimes involves bringing some code to it. In fact, you're going to find that sometimes you want to create apps that you want to add some code in them. And editing code like in ordinary text boxes can be quite the drag because it doesn't give you the kind of experience that you sort of expect as a code editor. You're going to find there's actually a fairly standard experience that you associate with editing code that you find in Visual Studio Code, Cursor, Windsurf, and JS Fiddle, all sorts of stuff. And that's because they all use the same like open source package from Microsoft called Monaco, which is an editor that is, like I say, open source that you can use to get that same experience over and over and over and over. It allows you to bring this experience that you associate with an IDE into your web browser and into your web apps. Now, ordinarily, Monaco uses things like service workers and what have you that can be a little tricky to integrate into a web application. And this is one of the reasons why people use things like npm or what have you to integrate it into the source code itself. But when we're using a low-code system, and using Weweb in particular, our ability to bring in external code is a bit more finite, right? So there are custom codes that we can do through the Vue.js integration with Weweb, and that can be a discussion for another time. But often what we want to do is bring something in that allows us to stay within the Weweb and the low-code environment without having to go to the outside world. So how do we do that? We do that by connecting with what we called content delivery networks that make a lot of really interesting external code available, and then pull it into our app a bit more on demand through what are called script tags. And in Weweb, because it's not strictly just a web page, but actually a web application that's running Vue.js and what have you, we got to jump through a couple more hoops, but they're not so bad, and we can actually make it all work inside the low-code environment and then control it through the low-code environment. Let's talk about how. What we can do here is first go searching on the web for how do we connect to Monaco, particularly if we want to do it through a CDN. So whenever you're looking into these low-code systems in general, the keyword you're looking for isn't just node. You want to do it from what's called a CDN. And even if you're going to be getting it from a CDN that's distributing the CDN version of a node package, that's going to be like the mental model you want to bring to this in order to be able to get more success out of it. And fortunately, this site called Stack Overflow, which is one of the most popular sites among developers on the web, generally very codey, but often can give you answers and shortcuts very quickly as to how to do this. And here you have a wonderful answer here that's talking about how to make all this stuff work. And there are, and it's showing how to have just an arbitrary piece of HTML, right? You don't have to have any Node.js or anything else. With it, they were able to make Monaco work. Let's study this for a minute to see how they made it work, and then how we can bring that into our Weweb environment. The first is we ask, what are they bringing in from the outside? And there are actually two things they're bringing from the outside. The first is the CSS, which is styling the editor. And that's actually a really important component because editors are very complicated. We usually get styles through what's called a link tag to bring a style sheet in. And there can be multiple style sheets you can bring in, but we're just going to use this default one as a starting point. The second thing is we have what's called a script tag, where we bring in outside code. Now, the weird thing about Monaco is all we're going to load in from the outside first is going to be their loader, right? Which is actually a relatively small amount of JavaScript. After that, it actually runs some code, some actual JavaScript on the page. That's what these lines are. And it's going to first configure the loader, because the require is actually the instance of the loader that was brought in through that script tag, to say, hey, please know this is going to be the editor I'm going to want, basically the Visual Studio version. And then I'm going to, connect it to an element on my page using getElementById, right? I'm going to find an element on my page with a correct identifier, and we will then, initialize it with some code. So we're going to talk about how to get this in. We're going to talk about how to get the initial code in, and then we'll talk about how to make it editable. But in order for us to make good use of this, we're going to need to bring some code into your, how to bring that external stuff into your Weweb. Now, Weweb does have a feature called custom code, and custom code allows you to bring stuff into the header, kind of like the script tags we were just looking at, but it only works for deployed sites, right? So that means we're not going to be able to test things or test interactivity when we're inside our editor. And so that's the reason why State Change has made this embed converter that allows you to take these various script tags and bring them into a format that Weweb can just consume through its workflows. So if I sort of take this first link tag here and I paste it into here, bing, and I have a link tag all the way down to the bottom, great. I can say, convert it to a JavaScript action. Then I can copy that to the clipboard, go back over to my Weweb, to my just blank project I got here. And what I will usually do in these circumstances is do an app workflow. And I'm going to say new here and say on app load, probably before I fetch any collections. I'm going to add an action. And then I'm going to have that action be the custom JavaScript action. And I'm just going to expand this for a second to make it easier to read. And I paste in what I just have from the embed. That's all there is to it. Now we have that style sheet, which will be loaded onto the page. The next thing we talked about is wanting to get that loader, right? The second script tag. Fantastic. I will get that script tag. Now, where this was on the page doesn't matter. We just want to make sure the code gets loaded. So we're going to go copy this, right? The script tag. We're going to convert it, copy, close to clipboard, go over here, and actually I can add it to the same JavaScript step. There's a little button over here that says Format Document. I totally recommend using it. You click this, and now you have, this sort of snaps stuff back into place. In addition to looking a little bit nicer, making it a little bit easier to read, it also gives you more confidence that, in fact, this doesn't actually have some sort of syntactic problem with it. If it didn't snap in, it would be an indication that there is some sort of problem that we need to examine more carefully. Okay, so this will load at the beginning of the page. And if I test it, it'll run, but it's not very interesting. So now let's close this up for a second. And that's happening at the very beginning of the application to make sure that the code that we need is going to be loaded. But the next thing we need is to, actually have an editor, right? That's the whole purpose of this exercise. So for that, we're going to need a rectangle. And a rectangle is a div. And let's just bring it out. And we will say layout, blank, flex, and it calls it a flex box because it's organized as a flex box. That's fine. We don't really care. Here I'm just going to set the width to 100% and set the height to a fixed, 500 pixels, just as a starting point here. Okay, so now I've got 500 pixels. I've got my div. And you know what else? I'm just going to make sure that it's easy for us to see where it is. I'm going to make it nice and green. Hello, Mr. Green Guy. No, I didn't want that guy to be green. Ooh, let's cancel that. Right? It's the flex box I want to be green, right? And the flex box is going to be, green, and wow, that's a little hideous. Let's see what we can do to get rid of that. But in order for us to load it up, right? We had the initial thing we load up with the application. We don't actually want to bring the code editor into play until we actually have a place to put the code editor, which is this rectangle. So the way we synchronize those two events is going to be through not click events, but through what we call mounted. This is part of what we call the life cycle of the div. Like sometimes Vue.js thinks about it, it mounts it onto the page, and then it removes it from the page, depending on where we are in the course of the application. So basically, when it mounts, that's going to be when we want to do some code, and we're going to have some custom JavaScript here. So here we have edit code, JavaScript, and we open this up. So let's find out what JavaScript we need to run. And here, what I will do usually is I will, copy all this stuff and then just paste it over in there and work with it on the other end. But we're going to need to examine it for a second. Okay? So there are a couple things going on here. The first is this idea of require and Monaco and document. You might wonder where are all those three things coming from, and you know what? Weweb's going to wonder the exact same thing, because there's an assumption built into the fact that it was running just on the HTML that require was attached to the window, and document is attached to the window, which is the global context in JavaScript. But that's not the case in the Weweb editor, because the Weweb editor is actually this big web page with an iframe that contains your actual document in it. So you want to make sure you're referencing the part that's the document that has the actual application as opposed to the window that has the editor. Because the window has the editor, you don't want to have all this stuff. You don't want to go messing with the editor. You want to mess with your application. Now, when your application publishes, there's actually not a difference between these two things. because your app is just sort of running. It's in the main window, and we're all glad for that. But it does mean that we want to maintain those distinctions so that we can have an easier editing experience in order to be able to modify the stuff. So to do that, we're going to need to make sure that we are explicitly referencing the correct context, which is, say, the correct window. To do that, we use www.lib, which is the gateway to all wonderful things that Weweb provides into JavaScript land. And we're going to do get front window .require.config. So now, instead of getting it from front context, from the context of the global, which is what the HTML assumed, we're going to be a little bit more sophisticated about it, and we're going to say it's coming from the front window context, which is just inside that application. If you just remember to, instead of using global context, throw in www.getFrontWindow, you're going to solve a lot of problems for yourself. And here are 3 examples that all work. And you can even do that for the same one in the document here. I'll also tell you there's a shorter version of getFrontWindow.document, which is called getFrontDocument. They both work exactly the same way. And now we have a getElementById here to a container. And what getElementById means is it's looking for something on the page that has an ID, which is a specific attribute that you can control in Weweb, called container. You know what? We're going to be a little fancy about this. We're going to call it Monaco demo. And then we're going to be happy with this. Okay, so I'm looking for an ID that's called Monaco demo. And if I run this, it doesn't actually do anything. In fact, if I look over here, it says type error, can't read properties of undefined. And reading config. Why? Because require hasn't run yet. Why hasn't require run yet? Require hasn't run yet because that first on application app workflow apparently has not run yet. That's okay. That's okay. So what we're going to do here is actually set the stage for just one more thing, which is we're going to say that this big rectangle here, this is the one we want to set the ID to. And you can set the ID using the fine tuning, which is the little, control board sliders. And we call this Monaco demo. Cool. Now we made a bunch of changes, and I'll tell you that whenever I'm working with like this external CDN stuff and like working with app load and whatever, it can be a lot faster to find out what things are going to work just by pressing the refresh button on the whole web page. Not the fastest experience in the world, but it goes, hey, look, we got ourselves a editor. And you'll see that the editor has has pushed itself down by a little bit. We're not totally sure why, but you can play with layout considerations afterwards. But here we have a function and a console log. Whoa, where'd it go? Okay, and everything seems to be there. Let's just run it again. Oh, and it didn't work. Well, that's interesting. Let's find out why it didn't work. Let's take a look at the log. And it says it can't find properties of undefined. Right? Basically the same problem, can't read config. And config, if you remember, and I appreciate there's a lot to remember in here, it was saying that because this config thing came from something called require. Now, this is usually a timing problem. So even though we said, please load my code at the very, very beginning of the lifecycle of the application, it's actually quite likely that it did not load it at the very beginning of the lifecycle of the application, and instead it is, or actually it ran it early, but then it ran this so fast after that require hadn't had a chance to load in before this code was running. So we want to make sure that A runs, then B runs. Now, A and B are running in completely different workflows. How do we make them wait for each other? And the way we do that is by telling it to please wait for that. So we make a quick little function here. Which will have a return new promise, our and this is I'll call it resolve instead, and we'll also set timeout of so what this will do is cause it to sleep, right? And what I'm going to say is while, and I'm going to say while if the required doesn't exist yet, right? And so the way I test for that is going to say null, await, sleep 500. So what this is going to do is going to say, hey, is it here? Nope, sleep for 500 seconds. Is it here? Nope, wait, no, we'll sleep for 500 milliseconds. And we'll say console.log counter +1. This is what we call a kill switch, because whenever you have a while, you're just concerned that you're going to go too many times. So I'll say if counter is greater than 100, break. Basically, it's just to make sure that we don't run it too many times. Log this ran too many times. So these are just little guardians we put into place to make sure we don't get into infinite loop situations, which definitely had happened before. And the idea is that we are saying, hey, as long as require is null, sleep, and then try it again, and then try it again, and then try it again. And frankly, if it runs for 100 times, which in this case would be about 50 seconds, if it's all waiting the proper way, then it will then it will abort. And if for some reason it's not awaiting, it'll go 100 times very fast and then abort. But the goal here is that we're not going to run any of the rest of this until we know or feel confident that require is ready for us to be able to do the rest of the work. And then that way we don't have that race condition. That we're saying basically we have A, and then B, which might start before A finishes, is waiting to know that A is finished before it continues. All right, let's see how that works for us. We're going to close this up. We're going to run this JavaScript, test it. It says it succeeded. Close. Yep. So you see some stuff. But now my big question is, does it run? Runs. Runs. Now there is I will often, when I'm working in anything in Weweb, say please look at my dev tools at the same time, because whenever you're building a web app, it's of course a web app. That means it's running inside the browser. So we have this we'll be able to see what's going on. You can see this thing that I put into the console.log actually showing up, right? So basically the first time it runs, it wasn't quite there, and so wait a half a second, it was there, it continued. So it was doing its job. That sleeping, that waiting until the next thing shows up, super powerful technique. And now we have, our editor that's running, and the editor says it's, got this stuff in it, and that's great. Now, I would like to be able to bind this and be able to have this get reflected in a variable so that we can actually be working with the data that's inside this header. And that involves two parts. The first is being able to initialize it with data that is from something else. And the second is being able to edit, being able to respond to changes in the editor. And to do that, we're going to, there are a couple things we're going to need to do here. One thing we will need to do is we're going to need to, let's just start by associating it with a variable, right? And we'll initialize it with a variable. To do that, we'll go over to data, and we're going to say we'll create a new variable, and the variable, we'll call it Monaco content. And the content is going to be hello there. Actually, you know what? We'll say, function hello message, and we'll say message. Okay, that's a very annoying experience, but it'll give you an alert every time that actually runs. We're not actually going to run this function, but it's just going to be code that we can have available to us. This is all fine, and that's going to be, and I don't really want it for the description. I want it for the default value, right? So we're just going to start that way. Hey, look, it sort of starts. You'll notice that here I've got enters when here it doesn't actually show the enters, and that's just a limitation of the way Weweb is reflecting this data back to you. So so now we've got Monaco content. Let's click into here for a second, and we'll say inside my Flexbox, I've got my custom JavaScript. Now, remember previously we were like pasting in this value between these two backtick characters? Well, instead, we could click on the X here, and we could say click in Monaco content, and it will pull it from a variable instead. Let's just show how that works. Close, and then again, just do a refresh. See, so now we've got the correct stuff. The next thing we want to do, though, is going to be, well, if I make a change in here, I want to be able to reflect that change in a variable that I can then do work with. And the way we do that in Weweb is through creating workflows. So we want to have a workflow that's going to respond to this thing changing. So let's on spec create ourselves a workflow. We'll create a new workflow that on execution, we'll call it update Monaco content. It's going to take a parameter called content. And we'll add an action here, and the action is going to be to change a variable value, and the variable value is the variable we're going to change Monaco content. We're going to change it to what came in through the parameters of the action. Look at that. Okay, so we're just going to, so all it does is just change the variable, and we will keep track of it by making a little text element underneath this, right? So we'll say underneath blank, we're going to say add another, div underneath that. And this one is, which one's which? This is the Monaco demo one. Okay, so let's make sure that Monaco goes on top here. And then this guy here, we're just going to add a text element, put that inside. And the flex box, we're just going to give it a little bit of a buffer because this thing seems to be dragging underneath. And the way we're going to do that is by saying we're going to say margin on the top is 50 pixels. And then the text itself, just contains some text. But the text is going to contain, as I go back over to here, is going to have, where's the text come from? Text is going to be whatever's in the content, okay? All right, so far, so good. Everybody, hello, everybody is all here. We're happy. I'm just going to make this guy a little bit bigger to make it easier for us to look at. And by doing that, we'll say the width will just be 100%, and the height I'll just allow to grow as it sees fit. Okay, so that now the trick though is that right now I can do an edit. Hello there, things, and nothing changes, right? So what we want to do is make it change. So for that, we're going to need to plant a listener that's inside the Monaco editor, right? So it's not going to be strictly a workflow that is coming from Weweb. It's going to be a workflow that we're going to need to plant inside the JavaScript when we build out this, this element here. And for that, we're going to go into the untitled workflow, go into the JavaScript, and the gag here is that having done this, require, right? Or either after we've done the require, we want to do a create, right? We're creating this editor. But then we lose track of the editor. So what I'm going to propose is that we make the editor into a variable that your browser is going to remember. And so I'll say www.getFrontWindow.Monaco editor equals. Okay, so now we're going to have a variable on the browser called Monaco editor. This is not the same thing as being a Weweb variable, but Weweb can access it by itself looking for www getFrontWindow Monaco editor. That can become valuable later. And then down here I can say www.getFrontWindow.Monaco editor get, and I'm pretty sure that at this point what I want to do is run get model, because the model is the thing that's inside the Monaco editor that actually deals with the relationship with the text. And then I'm going to have and then I want to have a look at an event called onDidChangeContent. And this is going to be, this will just require a function that runs whenever we change the content. And for this, we now want to run our workflow and tell it to please update the content based on the content that we have inside the model. Now, the way we get the model is content equals www.getFrontWindow.Monaco editor.get model.get value. There's a lot to it, isn't there? But like it's sort of all strings across. And by the way, if you're trying to figure out like how to do some of this stuff, there's actually wonderful. Sorry, that's the wrong thing to send. Copy and paste. Let me see, make sure that works. There we go. All right, so this is the documentation for the Monaco editor and tells you about how all the stuff works. It's very dense, it's very codey, but at least gives you names for things you can start to work with. And throwing this as a context into ChatGPT or Claude is also going to help you along. So the like this is all from the same website, obviously, just as more from the docs. So back over to here, we were going to say that the value of the content, right, is just the value from the model. And what we want to do is please run that workflow. Now, how do we do that? How do we run a workflow from inside the JavaScript land? We do that through www.executeWorkflow. Execute workflow takes two arguments. The first argument is, if I go to actions here, where it says update Monaco content, the first argument is going to be the ID of the workflow. Right, so now I pass that in, I put it between these quotation marks and returns red, you know you did it right. Now the second argument is going to be an object, and the object is going to be of the parameters. And the question is what the content is. And so the key that we had set up in the other thing was called content, and the value is the content variable that we just created here. So I'm just going to say, how about I just say Monaco content, and I'll say Monaco content, just so you have an easier distinction between what the key is and what the value is. As always, again, a little more complicated. I will just press this button to make sure that like things snap into place. It becomes a little more vertical, a little bit more readable, and finally, it just gives me that confirmation, right, that I'm doing it more or less correctly. Okay, so now it looks like I've got execute workflow. It seems to be flying. That's great. Let's close this up, and we're going to test the we can test, I suppose, this JavaScript, although the question is, did it mount? Oh, look at that. Get front window. That's because apparently I'm incapable of spelling. So let's find out why I did that mistake. Ding, 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 ding. Get front window. Get front. Oh, look at that window. Coding is a precise endeavor. And then if I run that again. Yeah. Okay, if I clear that, run that. Already has context attribute, blah, blah, blah. Okay, you'll notice that I've been creating a whole lot of these headers, and let's get out of this business. Obviously, the test, we only mount once, and that would be the more proper behavior. Okay, all right. So now we have all this. Look at that. See, it changes right down here. And the reason it's changing down here is because this text element is bound, right, to the, if I open this up, the text n is actually bound to the variable. And whenever I'm making a change in the code up here, it's changing and it's running the workflow with the edit. There's more that you can do here. You can make it so that making a change here goes and edits stuff inside your Monaco. You can add all sorts of additional complexities to like the plugins, etc., that you work with Monaco. And I'll tell you that like once you start getting beyond beyond a certain level of complexity, you're going to want to have more control over this using using tools that like a little bit native to code, and then bringing that in to be working inside your Weweb. This is where custom components, etc., can become helpful. But man, there's so much that you can accomplish bringing a relatively straightforward code editor to the benefit of your users, and hopefully this has shown how you can do so in Weweb in a relatively short period of time. Certainly bringing code into a no-code environment definitely counts as being potentially hard as 5% for a lot of things. So if you got more questions about that, drop a comment down below. And if you want to learn more about doing these things more in general, please come and check out State Change, where we work on these kinds of hard questions routinely and have a very good time doing it. I will look forward to seeing you next time.